Hey everybody, I'm Carl, and welcome back to my dark anthology. Today's story is going to be a little political and a little controversial, but it does reflect some of the concerns I have over the next coming years. Please take the time to watch it, and please comment your thoughts one way or the other, whether you think this story is completely off base or you share the same concerns as I do. And of course, as always, I'd really like your feedback on the video and the story itself. I still consider myself new to writing, and I would appreciate any feedback as far as that is concerned. Without any further ado, this is The Restoration.
October sunlight filtered through the open garage door, catching dust motes and the steam rising from David's coffee mug. The '67 Mustang skeleton dominated the space, its bare metal frame a promise of what could be. John Anderson wiped his hands on a shop rag, studying the engine block they'd just finished cleaning. "Looking good, Dad," Emma called from underneath the car, her voice muffled by the creeper she was laying on. At 18, she handled tools with the same confidence she'd shown in David's 7th grade English class, back when everything in her world was falling apart. "Watch that brake line," John cautioned, then turned to David. "What do you think?" David Torres set his coffee down and ran a hand along the engine's surface. "Clean as it's gonna get. Should be ready for rebuilding next weekend." He grinned. "I'll bring that new porter I've been working on. Finally got the recipe right." The radio on John's workbench crackled with campaign ads between classic rock songs. Restore American Values and Take Back America, mixed with Led Zeppelin and Lynyrd Skynyrd. Emma rolled out from under the car, grease streaked across her cheek. "Can we please change the station? If I hear one more political ad, I'm going to scream." John's jaw tightened slightly. "You're voting age now, kiddo. You need to stay informed." "Informed is one thing," Emma said, sitting up. "This is just angry." David caught John's eye, a familiar tension crackling between them. 15 years of friendship had taught them when to push and when to let things lie. "Speaking of informed," John said, reaching for a wrench, "you decide what you're doing about that ballot?" Emma's shoulders tensed. "Still thinking about it?" "Not much to think about," John said. "One side wants to protect our values, secure our borders, fix the economy. Other side just wants to tear everything down." David kept his eyes on the engine block, his hands steady as he worked. "Economy could use some fixing, that's for sure. My grocery costs are up 30% from last year." "Exactly," John nodded. "And I can't keep running a business with all these regulations and taxes. My guys are hurting too. Jorge had to pick up a second job just to cover his rent." "Yeah," David said quietly. "A lot of people are hurting." The radio crackled with another ad, this one warning about the dangers of radical educators indoctrinating our children. Emma glanced at David, but his expression remained neutral, focused on the task at hand. "Remember when we started this project?" Emma asked, changing the subject. She ran her hand along the Mustang's frame. "Grandpa would have loved seeing it come back to life." John's expression softened. "Yeah, he would have, though he probably would have given us hell about doing it wrong." "Remember that summer he taught you to change the oil?" David chuckled. "Man could make a simple task feel like a military operation." "If you're gonna do something, do it right," John quoted, his father's drawl slipping into his voice. "Ain't no such thing as good enough." They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the radio mercifully switching to Sweet Home Alabama. The familiar rhythm of tools and tasks took over, a dance they'd perfected over countless weekends. "Hey," David said eventually, "hand me that socket wrench. Think I found the source of that knocking sound." As John passed the tool, their eyes met. For a moment, the weight of their shared history hung between them. David sitting with Emma during lunch that terrible year, John helping David through his own divorce, countless birthdays and holidays, and quiet Sunday afternoons like this one. "Getting late," David said finally. "Better head home. James is making his mom's enchiladas tonight." "We're still on for the Jags game next weekend?" John asked. "Course." David wiped his hands clean. "Assuming we survive Election Day?" He meant it as a joke, but something in his tone made Emma look up sharply. John just shook his head, a slight frown creasing his forehead. "We'll be fine," John said firmly. "Country's been through worse. Just needs some restoration, that's all." He patted the Mustang's hood. Like this old girl here. David nodded, but his eyes lingered on the radio, still spitting out its stream of anger and fear. Yeah, he said softly. Just like that. I'll walk you out, Emma said, giving David a quick hug. Thanks for helping today, Uncle David. John watched them through the garage door as they walked to David's car, Emma gesturing animatedly about something. Probably their latest debate about classic literature. Some things hadn't changed since 7th grade. When Emma returned, she was quieter, thoughtful. She picked up a rag and started cleaning tools, a habit David had instilled in her years ago. Dad, she said finally, don't you think some of this election stuff might... they're talking about banning books, investigating teachers. David's a teacher. That's different, John said, not looking up from the engine. They're after the radical ones, the troublemakers. David's a good teacher, sticks to the classics, none of that political stuff. And what about when they talk about protecting traditional marriage or securing our borders? David and James... Look, John interrupted, his voice firm but gentle. David's family. Politics is politics, but that doesn't change how I feel about my friends. Besides, they're going after illegal immigration, not people like David who did things the right way. Emma set down the wrench she'd been cleaning, harder than necessary. That's not how it worked in history, Dad. They always start with. Emma Jean Anderson, John's tone carried a warning. I know you learned a lot in that AP history class, but this is different. This is about protecting our values, our way of life. David understands that. Does he? Emma asked quietly. Have you ever actually asked him? John didn't answer, just reached over and turned up the radio. Jimmy Buffett filled the garage, drowning out the questions neither of them wanted to face. Emma stared at her father's back as he busied himself with the engine, his shoulders tense. She knew that body language, the same way he got whenever someone at church brought up lifestyle choices, or when the pastor started talking about protecting our children from harmful influences. You remember when Mom left? Emma said suddenly, her voice barely audible over the music. John's hands stilled on the engine. Emma, no, Dad, listen. When she left, when she chose drugs over us, who was there? Who made sure I ate lunch every day that first month? Who stayed late after school just so I'd have somewhere safe to do homework while you were working double shifts? That's not the same thing. It is the only thing, Emma's voice cracked. David was there for us. He didn't care what anyone at school said about the druggie's daughter. He didn't care what people might think about a male teacher spending time with a female student. He just helped. John turned around, his face softening. Pumpkin, I know what David did for us. I thank God for him every day. But this election isn't about David. It's about protecting America from people who want to destroy everything we believe in. And what exactly do we believe in, Dad? Emma asked, picking up another tool to clean. Because I remember you teaching me that we believe in helping people when they're hurting, that we believe in loving our neighbors, that we believe in standing up for what's right. John opened his mouth to respond, but was cut off by another campaign ad. A deep, authoritative voice warning about foreign influences in our schools and protecting our children from dangerous ideologies. Emma switched off the radio. The silence that followed felt heavy, meaningful. I'm going to go clean up for dinner, she said finally. Youth group tonight, remember? John nodded, watching his daughter walk away. She moved with her mother's grace, but held herself with a strength all her own. When had she grown up so much? When had she started asking questions he wasn't sure how to answer? He turned back to the Mustang, running his hand along its frame. The metal was cool and solid under his fingers, uncomplicated. Cars made sense. You put in the work, followed the manual, and things turned out right. Not like the rest of the world, where everything seemed to be shifting under his feet. The garage grew darker as the sun set, shadows creeping in from the corners. John kept working, trying to lose himself in the familiar rhythm of tools and tasks, trying not to think about Emma's questions or David's quiet concerns or the gnawing feeling in his gut that maybe, just maybe, something was wrong with the world they were building. The next morning, sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across the worn pages of Emma's Bible. Pastor Richard's voice filled First Baptist of Jacksonville's sanctuary, his sermon drifting far from the gospel reading. And just as Jesus cleansed the temple, Richards thundered, we must cleanse our nation of those who would corrupt our children, who would destroy our values, who would replace God's truth with their corrupt and evil agenda. Emma felt her father nodding beside her. She glanced around the sanctuary, taking in the faces she'd known her whole life. Mrs. Peterson, who taught her Sunday school, the Ramirez family, who joined last year but hadn't been staying for fellowship hour lately, Mr. Wilson, whose lawn sported 3 different Jackson campaign signs. The upcoming election, Richards continued, his voice dropping to a stage whisper, is not just about politics. It's spiritual warfare. We're fighting for the very soul of America. Emma's phone buzzed in her pocket, a text from David. "How's the Mustang's timing belt looking?" She smiled, knowing it was his way of checking on her. He'd started doing that during 7th grade, finding small ways to make sure she was okay. "Put that away," John whispered, gentle but firm. Emma complied, and her father's hand found hers, squeezing it softly. Whatever their disagreements, some bonds went deeper than politics. After service, during fellowship hour, Emma noticed the Ramirez kids sitting alone. Their parents were talking quietly in Spanish near the door, their usual warm smiles replaced with worried frowns. "Mrs. Ramirez," Emma started toward them, but John caught her arm. "Come on, honey, Deacon's meeting in 5 minutes." "But Dad—" "Later," he said, already steering them toward the conference room. "Pastor Richards wants to discuss the church's role in protecting traditional values." Emma watched the Ramirez family slip out early again. She remembered how, just last year, Mrs. Ramirez's tamales had been the hit of the church picnic, how Mr. Ramirez had helped rebuild the playground. When had things started to change? In the conference room, deacons gathered around a long table, their faces serious. Campaign flyers mixed with prayer requests. Emma, allowed to attend as John's daughter, sat quietly in the corner, watching these men she'd known all her life plan what they called Christian political action. "We need to be warriors for Christ," Pastor Richards said, passing out voter guides. "The enemy is at our gates, in our schools, trying to destroy everything we hold sacred." Emma thought about David, who'd taught her Shakespeare and grammar and how to change a tire, who'd held her hand when her mother took off with a drug dealer, who went to a different kind of church with James, who, according to the voter guide in front of her, was part of the enemy. "Amen," the deacons murmured, her father's voice among them. On the drive home, Emma stared out the window at campaign signs dotting their neighbors' lawns. The morning sun made them look harsh and jarring against the neat suburban landscaping. "You were quiet in the meeting," John said, glancing at her. "Just thinking about what Pastor Richards said, about enemies and gates." John sighed. "I know it sounds harsh, but he's talking about ideologies, not people." "Like the ideology of letting people love who they love?" Emma kept her voice carefully neutral. "Or the ideology of welcoming strangers, like Jesus talked about?" "Emma," her father's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "It's more complicated than that. The world's changing too fast. We need to protect what matters." "What about the Ramirez family? They matter, don't they? But they're not coming to fellowship hour anymore. Did you notice?" John was quiet for a moment. "Carlos is a good man, works hard, pays his taxes. But nothing. Look, nobody's saying they have to leave. We just need better control over who comes in from now on. Better vetting. It's about law and order, not people like the Ramirez's." They pulled into their driveway. The Mustang's outline was visible through the garage window, waiting for next weekend's work. "Dad," Emma said as he turned off the engine, "what if they start vetting people like David and James next? What if—" "That's different," Mike cut her off, but his voice lacked conviction. "David, he's family. And the Ramirez's aren't—" John got out of the car without answering. Emma watched him walk toward the house, his shoulders hunched against questions he didn't want to face. That evening, the glow of the TV filled the living room. John sat in his recliner, remote in hand, while Emma curled up on the couch with her laptop. The news switched between coverage of a campaign rally and scenes of protest outside. "Look at this mess," John muttered, gesturing at the protesters. "These people don't even know what they're angry about." Emma glanced up from her laptop. "Actually, they're protesting the new voter ID requirements. Says here it could prevent 20% of Latino citizens from—" "CNA News says it's just about election security," John interrupted, changing channels, "making sure only legal votes count." "Dad?" Emma turned her laptop around. The state's own data shows almost zero cases of voter fraud, but thousands of citizens could lose their right to vote. John shifted uncomfortably. You can't trust everything you read online, honey. These fact checkers, they're all biased. Like CNA isn't. The words slipped out before Emma could stop them. John's jaw tightened. On screen, the crowd cheered as candidate Jackson called for a restore to order and protect real Americans. Emma's phone buzzed, a text from David. Grading papers. Found that essay you wrote in 7th grade about To Kill a Mockingbird. Still proud of you and all the hard work you've done. She looked up at her father, remembering how he'd taught her to stand up for her beliefs, to fight for the underdog. When had that changed? The news switched to a story about teachers being investigated for inappropriate materials. Classic books now deemed dangerous. Emma watched her father's face, searching for any sign of concern for David. But John just nodded along with the reporter's warnings about radical educators. Maybe we should work on the Mustang, Emma suggested suddenly. Still got an hour of daylight. John's face softened. Rain check, kiddo? Pastor Richards asked me to help with the voter outreach program tonight. The one targeting suspicious registrations in Hispanic neighborhoods? Emma, her father's voice carried a warning. It's about election integrity, that's all. But she knew deep down it wasn't. As John left for his meeting, Emma opened her laptop again. Senator Jackson's words echoed from the TV. We'll decide who the real Americans are. She thought about David, about the Ramirez family, about all the people who'd made their community what it was. Real Americans. Who got to decide what that meant? The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of campaign ads and rising tension. The Mustang sat neglected in the garage as John spent his evenings at voter outreach meetings and Emma buried herself in election research. Their Sunday dinners with David and James became quieter, heavy with things left unsaid. Then came election night. Inside, John and Emma sat in tense silence as results scrolled across the TV screen. Red and blue maps flickered, numbers ticked up, and pundits talked over each other with increasing urgency. Florida's looking good, John said, leaning forward in his recliner. Strong turnout in the rural counties. Emma refreshed her phone, scanning local results. Jacksonville's still counting. A lot of people had trouble with the new ID requirements. She paused. Mrs. Ramirez was turned away, said her documents didn't match exactly. If people want to vote, they need to get their paperwork in order, John said, but his voice held a note of uncertainty. Rules are rules. Her phone buzzed, a text from David. I know your dad voted for Jackson. No matter what happens, you are both still family. The network cut to Jackson's campaign headquarters, where the crowd was already celebrating. Ladies and gentlemen, the anchor announced, CNA is now prepared to call this election. Senator Richard Jackson will be the next president of the United States. The crowd erupted. Jackson strode onto the stage, his family behind him, flags waving. Emma watched her father stand, pride and relief washing over his face. My fellow Americans, Jackson began, his voice deep and certain. Tonight, we take back our country. Tonight, we restore our values. Tonight, we decide who the real Americans are. John cheered with the crowd on TV. Emma stared at her phone, at David's message blinking on the screen. She looked up at her father, his face glowing in the TV's light, and wondered if he understood what real Americans meant to people like Jackson. This is it, kiddo, Mike said, grinning. Things are finally going to change. Yeah, Dad, Emma whispered, her voice lost in the roar of the crowd. They really are? 2 weeks after the inauguration, the garage was filled with the sound of metal on metal as John and David hunched over the Mustang's engine block. Emma sat cross-legged on a workbench, scrolling through her phone while the radio played quietly in the background. There was a chill in the air from last night's unexpected freeze that even their hot coffees had difficulty fighting off. Hand me that wrench, David asked, his voice muffled from inside the engine compartment. Think I've found the problem with the timing belt. John passed the tool, then wiped his hands on a shop rag. About time. Been fighting with that all week. He glanced at the engine. Original parts are getting harder to find. The radio switched from classic rock to news. President Jackson signed another executive order today, implementing his Patriotic Education Initiative. The order requires schools receiving federal funding to adopt a new American heritage curriculum and prohibits the teaching of divisive concepts. Emma's head snapped up. David, isn't that... Yeah, David said quietly, his hands steady as he worked. Got the email this morning. All teachers have to submit their lesson plans for patriotic review by the end of next week. John straightened up. Well, that's good, isn't it? Getting back to teaching real American history instead of all this critical race theory stuff. Dad, Emma started, but David caught her eye, giving a slight shake of his head. It's a bit more complicated than that, John, David said, his voice carefully neutral. They're talking about removing To Kill a Mockingbird from the curriculum. Huck Finn, too. Those are classics, John frowned. You've been teaching those for years. Apparently, they promote racial division now. David's wrench slipped, clanging against the engine block. Sorry. Anyway, it's not just the books. They want us to not teach about anything that America ever did wrong. No Trail of Tears, no internment camps, no segregation. Maybe that's not so bad, John said, reaching for another tool. Kids need to be proud of their country. All this self-hatred isn't healthy. The radio crackled again. In other news, President Jackson's newly formed Military Readiness Council has recommended the immediate retirement of several top generals, citing concerns about their commitment to traditional military values. Jesus, David muttered. They're really doing it. John glanced up. Doing what? Those generals were all politicized anyway, too busy with their diversity training to focus on actual defense. John, David's voice was still calm, but Emma noticed his knuckles whitening on the wrench. First of all, the military is meant to be apolitical. That is supposed to give the officers the ability to say no to an order that is illegal. If the military are all his guys, they aren't likely to tell him no. Not to mention, these are combat veterans, career military officers with decades of experience. Losing all that experience just makes us weaker. And now they'll get to enjoy their retirement, John said firmly. Jackson's the commander-in-chief. It's his right to pick his own people. People that he knows are going to be loyal, David inserted. Loyal to him, not to America. The radio switched to coverage of protests in Washington. Police have deployed tear gas against violent protesters. Emma turned up the volume slightly, but John reached over and switched stations. Don't need to hear about those troublemakers, he said. They're just sore losers trying to divide the country. They're citizens exercising their rights, Emma said quietly. Like you taught me about in the Constitution. Not when they're destroying property, John countered. Law and order has to come first. David straightened up from the engine, wiping his hands. You know, this reminds me of that summer you rebuilt your dad's old Chevy. Remember how he insisted everything had to be original? John smiled at the memory. Sure do. Wouldn't even let me use modern brake pads. And what happened? John's smile faded slightly. Damn thing nearly killed me when the brakes failed coming off Butler Boulevard. Sometimes, David said carefully, the original isn't always better. Sometimes we need to acknowledge that improvements have been made, that we've learned from our mistakes. That's different, John said. Cars are simple. You follow the manual, replace what's broken, restore what works. The country's more complicated. Is it? David asked, gesturing to the Mustang. Look at what we're doing here. We're not just blindly putting it back the way it was. We're keeping what works, improving what doesn't, using better materials, safer systems. He paused, wiping his hands on a shop rag. Like how we're supposed to learn from history, make things better. But instead, he trailed off, then added quietly, 3 of my students got suspended yesterday for wearing armbands protesting the new curriculum guidelines. John looked up sharply. Since when do you allow political statements in your classroom? They weren't disrupting anything, John. Just quiet protest, like you used to talk about. Civil disobedience, peaceful resistance. Times are different now, John said. Country's too divided. We need unity. Unity or conformity? Emma asked. John's jaw tightened. Emma? No, Dad, really. What's the difference? Because from where I sit... That's enough, John cut her off. This isn't up for debate. The election's over. Jackson won. Now we all need to come together and support our president. David caught Emma's eye again, silently asking her to let it go. She subsided, but her fingers flew over her phone, texting her protest group from college. They worked in tense silence for a while, only the radio and the clank of tools filling the garage. Finally, David spoke again. "John, remember when you first brought this car home? How everyone said it was too far gone, not worth saving?" John nodded, his expression softening slightly. "But you saw something worth preserving," David continued. "Worth fighting for. Even if it meant changing some things to make it better." John ran his hand along the Mustang's frame. "Yeah, well, some things are worth the effort." "They sure are," David said quietly, his eyes meeting Emma's for a moment. "That's why we can't just stay quiet when we see something wrong, even if it makes things uncomfortable." Emma watched her father's face, searching for any sign of doubt, any recognition of where this might be heading. But his hands steady as he worked on the engine, that, piece by piece, they were trying to restore to some imagined perfect past that had never really existed. The next Sunday, the changes were harder to ignore. The fellowship hall, once filled with the aroma of potluck dishes from a dozen different cultures, now held only store-bought cookies and weak coffee. The Ramirez family's tamales were notably absent, as was Mrs. Chen's famous sweet and sour meatballs. John noticed the separate groupings, the old families on one side, the newer members huddled near the exits. Even the children seemed to understand the unspoken boundaries, no longer mixing freely during playtime. "Budget's tight this month," Deacon Wilson announced during the financial report. "Contributions are down 40%. He didn't mention the empty pews where laid-off workers used to sit, or the families who'd simply disappeared from the rolls. Pastor Richards' solution was predictable. We must tighten our belts, focus our resources on true members of our congregation. His eyes swept meaningfully across the room. Several families shifted uncomfortably. The next day at the shop brought more evidence of the changing times. Jorge, John's best HVAC tech for 15 years, was waiting in the office before opening. "I have to quit, Mr. Anderson," Jorge said, his eyes on the floor. "They're reviewing my grandmother's naturalization from 1985. Said my father's citizenship might be invalid, which means mine." He swallowed hard. "I can't risk being here when they come." John thought of all the systems Jorge had installed, all the customers who asked for him specifically. Jorge could diagnose a failing compressor just by sound, had memorized the quirks of every old unit in town. "We can figure something out. Maybe if I talk to—" Jorge shook his head. "My cousin waited too long in Arizona. They took everything, his house, his savings, put his kids in some kind of youth facility while they verified their status. Nobody's seen them since. They're going back generations now, invalidating marriages, birth certificates. Even people born here aren't safe anymore." After Jorge left, John threw himself into work, trying to lose himself in the familiar rhythm of service calls. But every customer brought a new reminder of how things had changed. Mrs. Henderson, whose family had been calling Anderson AC and heat for 3 generations, could only afford patch jobs now. "Insurance won't cover the replacement anymore," she explained, embarrassed. "They're saying our policy won't cover the higher prices for a new unit anymore." Mr. Chen needed his restaurant's walk-in cooler, fixed but couldn't risk shutting down overnight. "They watch businesses like mine now," he said quietly, looking for suspicious patterns. "One wrong move and—" He shrugged, the gesture carrying the weight of generations of learned caution. By the afternoon, John was back in the office. His receptionist was staring out at the window, biting her nails down to a nub. "Hope, is everything okay? You seem upset." "My sister's bakery in Tampa," she said, when John asked if she was okay. "They did an audit yesterday. Found problems with 3 of her employees. They were all Mexican. Sophia was working there for years. The police took them all away in cuffs. My sister, too." The August heat turned John's garage into a sauna, but they kept working. The Mustang's engine was finally back together, though something still wasn't quite right with the timing. Emma sat on her usual workbench, phone in hand, while John and David hunched over the engine compartment. "Try it now," David called. John turned the key, and the engine coughed, sputtered, then died. "Damn," John muttered. "Thought we had it that time." Emma's sharp intake of breath cut through the garage. Both men turned to find her staring at her phone, her face pale. "Emma?" John asked. "What's wrong?" It's the Ramirez family." Her voice shook. "They took them, all of them." David straightened up slowly, wiping his hands. "What do you mean, took them. DOD's new citizenship verification program. Emma's fingers flew over her phone. Maria's posting about it in the church group. They came at dawn, said Mr. Ramirez's citizenship was under review because his grandmother was undocumented when she had his father. John frowned. That doesn't make sense. Carlos was born here. He's as American as... They can't do that, John said, but his voice lacked conviction. Carlos coaches Little League. His kids were born here. He pays taxes. Like my parents paid taxes for 30 years before they got citizenship. David's voice was quiet, but it carried weight. Like I did everything the right way. But last week a woman at Publix told me to go back where I came from. John's head snapped up. Someone said what? Why didn't you tell me? David shrugged, turning back to the engine. What's to tell? It's not the first time. Won't be the last. But that's different, John protested. You're legal. You did it the right way. Did I? David's hands kept working, steady despite the tension in his voice. Because lately, seems like the right way keeps changing. First it was just undocumented immigrants. Then it was their children. Now they're reviewing naturalizations from the last 20 years for irregularities. Emma's phone buzzed again. They're taking them to Camp Roosevelt, that new processing facility the DOD built out by the air base. Processing facility, David echoed. Nice name for it. John grabbed a wrench, needing something solid to hold on to. Look, I'm sure there's a reason. They don't just take people without cause. Really, Dad? Emma's voice cracked. Because Maria says they took Mrs. Ramirez too. She's from Minnesota, born and raised. But they're saying her marriage to Mr. Ramirez is void because he wasn't legally a citizen when they got married. Silence filled the garage, broken only by the tick of the cooling engine. John stared at the Mustang's open hood, at the engine they'd spent months rebuilding. Everything had made sense when they started. Take it apart, clean it up, put it back together. Simple, clear. But now, this isn't what I voted for, he said finally. Isn't it? Emma's voice was gentle but firm. When they talked about taking back America, who did you think they were taking it from? David picked up another tool, his movements deliberately casual. You know what the scariest part is? Most of my students don't even seem shocked anymore. It's becoming normal. Every week, another empty desk, another family gone. But they must have done something, John insisted, though his voice wavered. Carlos must have... There must be a reason. Yeah, David said softly. He existed. That's becoming reason enough these days. He paused, then added, You know what Carlos said to me last month? Said he was grateful his grandmother wasn't alive to see this. Said at least she died believing in the American dream. John's hands clenched on the wrench. He thought about Carlos helping build the playground, about Mrs. Ramirez's tamales at the church picnic, about their kids in Emma's youth group. He thought about David, who was more brother than friend after 15 years. What? John's voice caught. He cleared his throat and tried again. What can we do? Emma and David exchanged a look. Maria says they're letting church members visit, Emma said carefully. To bring clothes and things. Maybe... John nodded slowly. Yeah, okay. He looked at David, really looked at him, maybe for the first time in months. I'm sorry. About the Publix thing. About all of it. David managed a small smile. I know, hermano, I know. They turned back to the engine, working in silence for a while. Finally, John spoke again, his voice rough. Think we'll ever get this old girl running right? Maybe, David said, reaching for a wrench. But first, we need to figure out what we broke while trying to fix it. February's chill crept through the garage despite the space heater's valiant efforts. Mike stared at the Mustang's engine, trying to make sense of the parts catalog's new prices. Beside him, David whistled low at the numbers. Double what they were last year, John muttered. If you can even find them. Some of these suppliers aren't even operating anymore. Emma looked up from her laptop. Another factory closing? She'd moved back home last month when her scholarship couldn't keep up with tuition increases. The local community college's website was open in another tab. The tariffs, David said, his hands buried in the engine compartment. Nobody can afford to import raw materials anymore. And with half the workforce? He trailed off, but they all knew what he meant. Between the deportations and people fleeing the economic collapse, many businesses had simply shut down. John's phone buzzed, another supplier saying they couldn't fill his shop's order, third one this week. He'd already had to lay off 2 mechanics, good men with families, the kind of men who'd voted for Jackson, believing in his promises of American prosperity. "Found one," Emma said suddenly. "Guy in Georgia's parting out a 67. He's got the timing gear we need." "What's he asking?" John's voice was resigned. Emma winced. $250 plus shipping. Jesus. John ran a hand through his hair, now more gray than brown. "That part was $90 last year." "Everything's twice as expensive now," David said dryly. "Except teaching supplies. Those are 3 times more expensive when you can get them. Districts talking about going to 4-day weeks to save money." John grabbed a wrench, craving the weight of something substantial in his grip. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Jackson said the tariffs would bring manufacturing back, create jobs. Like deporting 12 million people would solve the labor shortage. Emma's voice was gentle but firm. Or like cutting off trade with our biggest partners would lower prices. "Emma," John started, but his heart wasn't in it anymore. The numbers didn't lie. His business was barely staying afloat, and he was one of the lucky ones. Main Street looked like a ghost town, half the stores empty. The church food bank, where he volunteered Wednesdays, had lines around the block, mostly middle-class families who'd never needed help before. David's wrench slipped, clanging against the engine block. "Sorry, it's getting hard to see in here." He reached for the work light, but it flickered and died. "Perfect." "Sorry, we are out of batteries," Emma said. "They're hard to find. You know they come from China. They're pretty expensive now." John checked his wallet, found it empty except for a Jackson food ration card. The irony wasn't lost on him. "Remember when we started this project? Thought we'd have her running by Christmas." "Which Christmas?" David asked, but his attempt at humor fell flat. They all remembered last Christmas, the small crowd shopping at the stores, the bare grocery shelves, the patriotic austerity speeches on TV. Emma's phone chimed with a news alert. They're expanding Camp Roosevelt again, adding another 10,000 beds. Where are they finding the money for that? David wondered, when they can't even keep schools open 5 days a week. John thought about Carlos Ramirez, still detained after 6 months, about his kids who should have been in David's class this year, about all the small businesses, like his own, that were 1 bad month away from closing. We could, John started, then stopped, started again. Maybe we could visit this weekend. Take some supplies. David and Emma exchanged a look. They'd been making regular visits to Camp Roosevelt, though Mike had always found excuses not to go. Too busy at the shop, too much work on the Mustang, too many deacons meetings. "Yeah, Dad," Emma said softly. "We could do that." John nodded, not trusting his voice. He turned back to the engine, but the parts blurred before his eyes. Everything had made sense 2 years ago. Protect American jobs, secure the borders, restore order. Simple solutions that they told me they would fix all the problems. Now he couldn't even fix a damn car. "Found another supplier," Emma said after a while. "In Mexico." Her voice carried a hint of irony. "Parts are cheaper there. If they were still allowed to sell to us." "Doesn't matter," John said quietly. "Dollar's too weak now anyway." They worked in silence for a while, trying to make do with what they had. The space heater sputtered and died, another victim of the rolling blackouts. In the darkness, the Mustang's skeleton looked almost accusatory. "You know what Carlos used to say?" David's voice cut through the gloom. "About classic cars? Said they were like his grandmother's stories about coming to America. Lot of broken parts, lot of hard work, but worth it because you were building something better." John's throat tightened. He thought about his own grandmother's stories, about the Depression, about pulling together, about helping neighbors even when you had nothing yourself. "Maybe," he said finally, "maybe we've been trying to restore the wrong things." Outside, another military convoy rumbled past, heading toward Camp Roosevelt. But this time, John didn't avoid David's eyes. This time, he held his friend's gaze and saw in it a reflection of his own growing certainty that something had to change. "So," Emma said into the darkness, "what are we going to do about it?" The question hung in the air, heavy with possibility and fear. John looked at the Mustang, at his daughter, at his friend. at the life they were trying to restore, piece by broken piece. "We start with what we can fix," he said finally, "and work our way up from there." The sun was setting when they heard a car sputter into the driveway, the engine's uneven idle making David wince. "That'll be James," he said, wiping his hands. "Timing shot on the Civic. Been meaning to look at it, but—" "Thought you had that Subaru?" John asked, remembering the newer car James used to drive to his practice. "Had to sell it," David said quietly. "Medical board's new insurance requirements, plus with the registration fees doubling for non-traditional households." He shrugged, trying to keep his tone light, but Emma caught the strain in his voice. James appeared in the garage doorway, still in his scrubs, looking tired but brightening at the sight of them. "How's the patient?" he asked, nodding toward the Mustang. "Better than yours from the sound of it," David teased, crossing to kiss his husband hello. Even after 12 years together, Emma noticed, they still lit up around each other. "You should hear Mrs. Chen's blood pressure when I tell her to take it easy," James said. "Speaking of which," he pulled a paper bag from his coat pocket. "Her son sent more dumplings, said to share with our other family." John started to protest, but James held up a hand. "Doctor's orders. Emma needs protein for all this mechanical work she's doing." Emma grinned. James had been fussing over her diet since she was in middle school, when he first noticed her skipping lunches after her mom left. He'd started bringing extra food to David's classroom, casual offerings that somehow always ended up in her backpack. "Remember when you tried to teach me to use chopsticks?" she asked, accepting a dumpling. "At that career day lunch?" "You stabbed yourself in the thumb," James laughed. "Gave me my first patient at the school." "And your last," David added. "Once the administration found out we were dating." A shadow crossed James's face. Different times then. At least they just asked me not to volunteer anymore. Now they're talking about reviewing all medical personnel who work with children. John looked up sharply. "They can't do that. You're a doctor." "They can do whatever they want, John," James said softly. "Why do you think we sold the Subaru? Need to keep cash liquid just in case." He trailed off, but they all heard the unspoken words. "In case we have to leave." David moved closer to his husband, their shoulders touching. Emma remembered when they first started dating, how careful they'd been around John, until the night David's ex-wife tried to use their relationship to get full custody of his kids. John had marched into court, testified that James was the best thing that had ever happened to their extended family. The judge, an old fishing buddy of John's father, had dismissed the case on the spot. "Hey," John said suddenly, "you know what would help with your electric bills? I could install one of those new smart thermostats I've been saving. Better than letting it go to waste in my shop." James blinked. "You'd want—" "Course we would," Emma chimed in. "Family discount, though. And you have to help install it." "I barely manage my phone settings," James protested, but he was smiling. "About time you learned some practical skills," David said. "You're always saying doctors should have hobbies outside of medicine." "Pretty sure I meant golf or tennis," James laughed. "Not crawling around in attics with ductwork." "Too late," Emma declared. "You're one of us now. One of us, one of us. Gooba gaba." "God help me," James sighed, but his eyes were bright as he watched David and Mike already planning the installation. This was why they stayed, Emma realized. Not just because of the practice James had built, or David's students, but because of moments like this. Family pieced together from broken parts, stronger at the connections. The Civic's engine knocked in the driveway, a reminder of harder times ahead. But for now, they had dumplings and plans and each other. Sometimes, Emma thought, that had to be enough. The August evening air hummed with cicadas as David made final adjustments to the carburetor. John sat ready in the driver's seat, while Emma perched on her usual workbench, all of them holding their breath. 6 months of scrounging parts, of makeshift repairs, of hoping. It all came down to this moment. "Okay," David said, stepping back. "Try it now." John turned the key. The engine coughed once, twice, then roared to life. The sound was perfect. A deep, healthy rumble that echoed off the garage walls. For a moment, none of them moved, as if afraid any sudden motion might break the spell. Then Emma whooped, jumping down from her perch. "You did it! You actually did it!" "We did it," David corrected, grinning as he wiped his hands. "All of us." John revved the engine slightly, his face glowing with pride. The Mustang responded smoothly, purring like it had just rolled off the assembly line. He cut the engine and got out, running his hand along the car's frame. "Never thought we'd see her running again," he said softly. "Not with everything?" He trailed off, but they understood. With parts nearly impossible to find, with inflation making every purchase a struggle, with the world seeming to fall apart around them, finishing the car had become more than just a project. It was proof that some things could still be fixed. "Calls for a celebration," David said, reaching into a cooler. He pulled out 3 bottles of his home-brewed porter, a luxury these days, with commercial beer prices through the roof. "Been saving these for a special occasion." They settled into their usual spots, John on an old lawn chair, David leaning against the workbench, Emma cross-legged on top of it. The garage felt different somehow, warmer, more like home than it had in months. "To the Mustang," David said, raising his bottle, "and to family." They clinked bottles. Emma pretended to sip hers, David noticed, barely wetting her lips. Come to think of it, she'd been quieter lately, missing their usual Sunday dinners. Even now, as John and David discussed plans for the car's first real drive, she seemed distracted, lost in thought. "So," David said during a lull, keeping his tone casual, "how's that new boyfriend of yours? Jason, right? Haven't heard you mention him lately." Emma placed her bottle down on the workbench purposefully. "Emma?" Mike started to rise with a father's worry on his face. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry, Dad. I'm pregnant." The garage went silent except for Emma's quiet sobs. John sank back into his chair, his face unreadable. "Billy," he said finally, his voice tight. "He knows?" Emma nodded. He left. Said he couldn't handle a baby. Said it was my fault and my problem. Said he's moving north to try to find work." John's hands clenched into fists, but before he could speak, David stepped forward. "Does anyone else know?" "Just Maria," Emma said, wiping her eyes. "She helped me find a clinic, but, Dad, I want to keep it. Even with everything so messed up, I want—" "Of course you're keeping it," John said, his voice rough with emotion. He stood and crossed to his daughter, pulling her into a tight hug. "We'll figure it out. Together." David watched father and daughter hold each other, remembering all the times they'd been there for him. When he'd lost his job, when James had been threatened, when his students started disappearing. Family wasn't about blood, he'd learned. It was about who stood by you when the world turned dark. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I seem to remember a certain single father, about 8 years ago, scared out of his mind about raising a daughter alone." John looked up, managing a weak smile. Seemed to remember a certain English teacher who made sure that little girl always had somewhere safe to go after school. "And now look at her," David said softly. "Strong enough to face this head on, honest enough to tell us the truth. You did good, John. Both of you did good." Emma wiped her eyes, looking at the Mustang. "What are we going to do, Dad? Everything's so expensive, and the hospitals—" "We'll figure it out," David repeated firmly. "James can help with the medical stuff. And the car?" David paused thoughtfully. "My students need somewhere to learn about real American values, like family taking care of family." He squeezed Emma's shoulder. "Besides, that baby's going to need to learn about classic cars from someone who knows what they're doing." John laughed, a real laugh for the first time in what felt like years. "You saying I don't know what I'm doing, Torres?" "I'm saying that carburetor would still be giving us fits if I hadn't fixed your adjustment last week." Emma watched them banter, her heart lightening. Outside, the world was still broken, still scary. But here in the garage, with the purring Mustang and the 2 men in the world who meant the most to her, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. "So," David said, "a baby, huh? You know what this means?" He grinned at John. "We're going to need to install some car seats." John groaned, but he was smiling. The smell of fresh bread and herbs filled David and James's small kitchen, as Emma pulled another loaf from the oven. Sunday dinner had become their ritual of normalcy, even if the menu was simpler these days. The garden she'd started in March, with James's patient guidance, had flourished. Tonight's salad came entirely from the backyard. "That basil's looking good," James said, peering over her shoulder at the herbs she was chopping. His hands were precise as he sliced tomatoes, each movement efficient from years of practice. Despite the gray touching his temples, his dark eyes were warm and bright behind his glasses. Told you that corner spot would get the right amount of sun? Yeah, you're always right, Emma teased. Must be exhausting, being perfect all the time. Oh, it is, James grinned. Just ask David. Stop inflating his ego, David called from the living room, where he and John were setting the table. His head's big enough already. The easy banter continued as they brought dishes to the table. Fresh bread, garden salad, a modest pot of spaghetti made with Emma's homegrown tomatoes. In another time, it might have seemed like a simple meal, but these days, having enough to share was a luxury worth celebrating. Remember when you used to kill every plant you touched? James asked Emma as they settled around the table. Now look at you, practically feeding the whole family. Well, some of us had a very patient teacher, Emma said, even if he did spend half of medical school growing the special herbs in his dorm room window. Had to pay for books somehow, James shrugged. Besides, those herbs got me through more than a few anatomy finals. John raised an eyebrow, and James quickly added, The legal kind, John. Chamomile, peppermint, I promise. They fell into the comfortable rhythm of passing dishes and sharing stories. James talked about his family practice, now overwhelmed with patients who couldn't afford the big hospitals. David shared news about former students who still kept in touch, though his voice tightened when mentioning those who had disappeared into the system. John updated them on the AC and heating shop, still struggling but surviving. Emma was quieter than usual, John noticed. His father's eye caught the slight tremor in her hand as she reached for her water glass, the way she barely touched her food. He'd been watching her carefully since she'd told them about the pregnancy, worried about how she was handling the stress. Emma? He asked softly. Everything okay? The table went silent. Emma set down her fork, her face pale. I had some pain yesterday, and this morning. There's something wrong. John straightened. What kind of pain? Where? Sharp, lower right side, and there was some bleeding. Emma's voice shook. I didn't want to worry anyone, but... James put his hand gently over hers. Do you want me to tell them? Emma nodded with tear-filled eyes. She called me yesterday, James said, meeting David and John's concerned looks. I got her in for an ultrasound at the clinic. He gently squeezed Emma's hand. It's ectopic, the embryo implanted in her fallopian tube. John's fork clattered against his plate. What does that mean? Is she going to be okay? James took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. An ectopic pregnancy can't survive. The tube isn't meant to support a growing embryo. If left untreated... He squeezed Emma's hand a little more. It's dangerous. The tube can rupture, causing internal bleeding. It's a medical emergency. So you can fix it? John asked. Do whatever surgery you need to do? James and David exchanged a look. It's not that simple anymore, James said quietly. The state laws, they don't make exceptions, even for ectopic pregnancies. Any termination, even to save the mother's life, is illegal here now. That's insane, John exploded. This isn't about politics. It's about saving my daughter's life. I know, James said, his voice heavy with frustration. Believe me, I know. I've had to send 3 women out of state this month alone for similar situations. The medical board is watching us like hawks. One wrong move and we lose our license. John asked, How long until... Emma hadn't seen such fear and pain in her dad's eyes since her mom left them. Not long, James said gently. A few days, maybe 2 weeks on the outside, before the risk becomes critical. There's a clinic in Illinois that can help. I've already called them. Illinois? John's face paled. That's hundreds of miles. And crossing state lines for this, isn't that illegal now too? As far as Florida State is concerned, yes, James nodded. Right now it's not all that enforceable, but they are making us report all the data, and it's just a matter of time. David, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke. When do we leave? David! James started, but his husband cut him off. No, I'm not sitting here debating while Emma's life is at risk. We're going. All of us. John nodded firmly. The Mustang's ready. We can take back roads, avoid the checkpoints on the interstate. It's not just the travel, James said. The procedure, the clinic stay, it's expensive. Insurance won't cover it out of state, not for this. We've got savings, David said. And I can sell some tools from the shop, John added. Emma looked around the table at her family. Her father, who'd raised her alone, David, who'd helped guide her through her darkest days, James, who'd taught her to grow vegetables. I can't ask you all to risk this. The penalties if we're caught. You're not asking, John said firmly. We're telling. James squeezed her hand again. Your father's right. Family takes care of family. And as your doctor and your friend, I'm telling you this isn't optional. We need to go as soon as possible. They spent the next hour planning, James providing medical details and clinic contacts, David mapping routes through friendly states, John listing what tools he could sell quickly. The remains of dinner grew cold and forgotten in the urgency of the moment. We'll leave Tuesday, John finally said. Early, before dawn. The clinic's got a good network, James added. They can provide documentation that makes it look like a routine medical consultation if we're stopped. And I know doctors there. They'll help us. Still risky, David said, glancing at his husband. If the medical board finds out you're involved... I took an oath, James said firmly, to do no harm. Forcing Emma to continue a pregnancy that could kill her, that's harm. I'm done playing it safe while people suffer. As they cleared the table, James caught David alone in the kitchen. This could cost us everything, he said softly. The clinic, my license, maybe worse. I know, David replied, pulling him close. But they've taken away all our choices, and family comes first. Always has. Outside, cicadas sang in the growing darkness. Emma's garden swayed gently in the evening breeze, the tomato plants heavy with fruit, the herbs releasing their fragrance into the air. Life persisted, James thought. Life found a way to grow, even in the hardest soil, even against the strictest laws. The Mustang's engine purred as they crossed into the Florida panhandle, its restored strength carrying them through the pre-dawn darkness. In the back seat, Emma lay with her head in James's lap while he monitored her vital signs. David was in the passenger seat, constantly looking up the newest updated information on his phone, guiding them along back roads to avoid the main checkpoints. Blood pressure's holding, James murmured, his fingers gentle on Emma's wrist. How's the pain, sweetheart? Manageable, Emma whispered, but her face was pale and drawn. Just keep talking. Helps me focus on something else. Remember when you first started that garden? James asked, trying to keep his voice steady. You killed 3 tomato plants in the first week. Your fault. Emma managed a weak smile. Should have warned me about overwatering. Had to let you learn somehow, James said, catching David's eye in the rearview mirror. His husband gave him a tight smile, then went back to studying the apps on his phone. John's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his eyes constantly darting to the rearview mirror. The Mustang's engine seemed too loud in the pre-dawn quiet, its rumble carrying too far in the still air. County line coming up? David said softly. Should be clear this time of morning, but... Red and blue lights suddenly flared behind them. John's heart stopped. County sheriff, David reported, twisting to look back. Single car. Stay calm, James said, his doctor's voice steady. We've got our story straight, just a family trip to visit relatives. John pulled over, the Mustang's engine ticking in the silence. 2 deputies approached, one on each side, flashlights sweeping across the car's interior. License and registration, demanded the deputy at John's window. His nameplate read, Collins. His partner circled to the passenger side, light lingering on David's face. John handed over his documents with trembling hands. Everything all right, officer? Routine check, Collins said, but his tone suggested otherwise. Been some trouble with people trying to cross state lines illegally? Where you folks headed? Visiting family in Georgia, John said, the practice lie tasting like ash in his mouth. At 4 a.m, Collins' light swept the back seat, catching Emma's pale face. What's wrong with her? Just carsick, James said quickly. I'm a doctor. We're... Doctor? The second deputy's light snapped to James's face. Let me see some ID. As James reached for his wallet, Emma suddenly gasped, doubling over in pain. Uncle James, she choked out. Something's wrong. James's face went white. She's crashing. The tube, it must have ruptured. He reached for his medical bag, but Colin's partner grabbed his arm. "Don't move," the deputy snarled. "Nobody's going anywhere until we figure out what's really going on here." "She needs help," James tried to pull free. "She's bleeding internally." Collins yanked open the driver's door, dragging John out. "Out of the car! All of you, now!" "Please," John begged. "My daughter's dying." Emma screamed, the sound cutting through the night. James lunged for his bag, but the deputy slammed him against the car. David moved to help his husband, and suddenly everything exploded into violence. The shot cracked across the empty highway. David staggered, red blooming across his chest. James's scream of anguish gave away everything they'd tried to hide. "David!" James caught his husband as he fell, cradling him close. "No, no, please, baby, stay with me." "Fucking queers," Colin's partner spat, his boot catching James in the ribs. "Should have known." John watched in horror as the deputies beat James, their batons rising and falling with sickening thuds. David lay motionless on the pavement, his blood pooling in the flashing lights. And from the back seat, Emma's breathing grew more labored. "Daddy," she whispered as John climbed back in beside her. "I'm cold." "I'm here, baby girl." John pulled her close, feeling her life slipping away. Outside, James's pleas for mercy turned to broken sobs. The Mustang's engine ticked as it cooled, each sound like a clock counting down the moments. John held his daughter, watching her face grow paler. All those hours they'd spent rebuilding this car, believing they could restore something precious, make it run like new again. But some things, once broken, couldn't be fixed. "I'm sorry," he whispered, tears falling onto Emma's hair. "I'm so sorry. This is my fault. I thought things would be better." Emma's hand found his, squeezed weakly. "Not your fault, Daddy. You tried to fix it." Her words trailed off as her hand went limp. In the growing dawn, John could see David's blood seeping under the car, could hear James's crying turn to whimpers as the deputies continued their assault. The red and blue lights kept flashing, painting the scene in alternating colors of a nation torn apart. The sun rose over the highway, illuminating the Mustang's polished chrome and perfect paint, a beautiful shell containing unimaginable tragedy. John held his daughter's body, rocking gently as sirens approached in the distance. They had restored the car together, piece by piece, believing they could rebuild anything with enough love and patience. But they couldn't restore the humanity that had been stripped away, couldn't rebuild the trust that had been shattered, couldn't bring back the lives that had been sacrificed in the service of fear and hatred. The Mustang sat silent now, its engine cold, its restoration complete but meaningless. John looked out at David's still form, at James's beaten body, at the deputies standing proud over their handiwork, and understood at last the true cost of believing in simple solutions to complex problems. Emma's blood soaked into the Mustang's leather seats, marking them forever with the price of their failure. In the distance, more police cars approached, their sirens wailing in grief for what their life was. The sun climbed higher, revealing a scene that would haunt John for whatever remained of his life. His daughter dead in his arms, his friends broken on the pavement, and the car they'd rebuilt together, standing silent witness to the destruction of everything they'd tried to save. The Mustang had been restored to a perfect shine, but inside, where it mattered most, everything had been lost.
Well, that was the restoration. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for sticking with it and listening this long. As I said, it is controversial, it is political, but it does reflect my concerns about the upcoming years. I don't think I've ever wanted to be wrong so much in my life, but those are my concerns and worries. I do distinguish a difference between the extreme right and what I feel like is the majority of people that voted for Donald Trump this last election, and I don't condemn them. I think most of them were just looking for a better life, and Trump seemed like the easy answer and fix. But I don't think he is the easy answer and fix. I think he's leading our country down a darker path. But I'm open to any civil conversation about it, so please leave your comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And as always, I'm still pretty new to this, so please leave any comments about the video production or the writing itself, the quality of the writing itself. I'm always looking to improve. I hope you all have a good day, and we'll see you here next time.